Study in the study on the Tabernacle, study number 8. We're going to be talking about the very last part as we come to, remember, we've got the outer court, which is the first part, and then we come to the holy place, which is the first room, and then of course the last room is what we're looking at this evening, that is the Holy of Holies. And remember, that's only entered once, one time a year, twice on that day, and so we're going to be looking at that. But I want to call your attention up here. You know that you're familiar with words Yom Kippur, and of course really Yom is day in Hebrew, and Kippur is the word atonement. So Day of Atonement is really when they're talking about Yom Kippur. Now, as far as the calendar, I've got here for you, this year it'll be on October 25th, and next year it'll be on September the 21st. But I remind you that it always starts at 6 p.m. the day before, because it goes 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. is how they look at it. So in other words, the October 25th, this one would actually start at 6 p.m. on October the 24th, and then end on October 25th at 6 p.m. But that's important. The other thing is to remember that it's interesting that this is the only one that's officially stated in terms of the Mosaic Law as far as being a fast day. They were expected to fast the entire 24 hours. They were not to take anything in at all as far as any food or anything like that. So it's a very important day. It's much more in terms of fasts than it is feast, because it's listed as one of the feast days, but in reality it's really a fast day. Now, I want you to notice this. We're going to be looking at this in just a moment, but the high priest is the only one that enters in. Remember, he has to go behind the final veil into the Holy of Holies, and of course there to the mercy seat and the Ark of the Covenant. And of course he goes there twice, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But he's the only one that's permitted back there. Nobody else is permitted back there. And so as a result, that's very, very important for us, our study. Now, I want to also call your attention over here. In Scripture, in terms of angels, there's angels mentioned. Of course, we have the archangels and so forth. There's also two distinct groups of angelic type beings. God created some special angelic type beings. Those two being seraphims and cherubims. Now, it's interesting. Seraphims are only mentioned 3 times. And you're familiar with it, I'm sure, there, especially in Isaiah 6, in that vision that Isaiah has in the temple. So you've got seraphims in Isaiah 6, Ezekiel 1, and also in Revelation chapter 4. But when you come to cherubims, that's a different situation, because over 20 times you're going to find cherubims mentioned. Of course, we begin with that, remember, the Garden of Eden, because remember the cherubims, you remember that were put up and, kept Adam and Eve from going back in. So in other words, we start there, and of course we go all the way to the book of Revelation. But anyhow, that's important. These seraphims and cherubims, and some people confuse the two, and they're two distinct things. And as far as, if you look at the description in Scripture, you'll find out, you can understand the difference between the two. But anyhow, that's important. And of course, cherubims are going to come in and study this evening. Seraphims will not, of course. All right, now let's, if you will, take your study guide there, and then I'm going to lead you through what the experience of what the high priest would have done for himself, in addition to his family, and also for the nation of Israel. But let's begin by looking at the fact about the Ark of the Covenant. So notice, if you will, Exodus chapter 25, verses 10 and 11 and verse 16.
And they shall make an ark of acacia wood. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, 1.5 cubits its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. And you shall overlay it with pure gold, inside and out you shall overlay it, and shall make it on a molding of gold all around. And then 16, and you shall put into the ark the testimony which I will give you.
Now bear in mind, the word covenant is important to us, because remember, we have the old covenant, which is based on the law. We have the new covenant based on the blood of Christ. And so that's the difference between the two. But as we think about the Ark of the Covenant, it's a reminder of the covenant God had made. And as we think about it in a moment, we're going to be talking about the 3 things that were below the mercy seat there in the Ark of the Covenant. God purposely had them put in there because they're a reminder of what this covenant really related to. Now you notice the room is 15 by 15. And then you notice also the curtain. And we talked about this last time. Remember, that curtain is not just a curtain like in your house. Remember, that thing was 13 inches thick. And so it was a massive curtain. And so the only way that of course there was no door in, so obviously the high priest would have had to go around the end to get in there, and they would have pulled that back for him to get in, because he's the only one had access, and the only one could go in there. And find out tonight he went into there twice during this experience. But notice also now, we think about the ark itself, notice as David read for us, it's made of wood. Again, it reminds us in terms, remember, wood speaks the humanity of Christ, gold shows us the divinity, and so there was that covering over of the gold. And then also notice the parts of it. If you'll read for us, David, I believe you're reading also verses 17 through 22 in chapter 25 of Exodus.
You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, and 1.5 cubits its width. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold of hammered work. You shall make them at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make one cherub at one end, and the other cherub at the other end. You shall make the cherubim at the 2 ends of it of one piece with the mercy seat. And the cherubim shall stretch out their wings above, covering the mercy seat with their wings, and they shall face one another. The faces of the cherubim shall be toward the mercy seat. You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I will give you. And there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the mercy seat. From between the 2 cherubim which are on the ark of the testimony, about everything which I will give you in commandment to the children of Israel.
Now notice the 2 parts now. You've got below, you have the container where we have these 3 things we're going to be talking about in book of Hebrews in just a moment. But notice also that, again, we have above that, we have the mercy seat, and then we have the cherubim. Remember, the cherubims always show us the significance of those. It means the presence of God. And you notice it says in what David just read for us, says they were looking down on the mercy seat, looking down on what God had provided. Now it's interesting that it's called the mercy seat, and right below that is the law. Remember, the law spoke of judgment and justice. God says place the mercy seat over that as a reminder of what I've done as far as provision I'm making. And of course, the provision came because the blood that we're going to find out was placed there on the mercy seat. But that's important as we think about the 2 parts of it. Now, let's look, if you will, in Hebrews chapter 9. Now, I told you before, make sure always when you're studying the Tabernacle, make sure and read these passages in Hebrews, because it clearly tells us exactly, of course, we're especially concerned about its relationship to Christ. So let's look at Hebrews chapter 9, verses 1 through verses 4.
Now even the first covenant had regulations for divine worship and the earthly sanctuary. For a tabernacle was equipped, the outer sanctuary, in which were the lampstand, the table, and the sacred bread. This is called the holy place. Behind the second veil there was a tabernacle, which is called the most holy place, having a golden altar of incense, and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden jar holding the manna, Aaron's staff which budded, and the tablets of the covenant.
Look at the 3 parts now that are in there, the contents that are in there. The significant, again, remember, God provided for them food, remember, in the wilderness, and that was manna. And so there's a reminder as far as God's provision there. Secondly, also, you remember there was a question raised about who was in charge in regard to Aaron. And you remember what God did? Said, listen, I'm going to show you exactly who is in charge. And of course, you remember Aaron's rod budded as a result of God saying, this is the one I've selected. The people were questioning his leadership as to whether he had a right to be that leader. And God said, I'll show you who's in charge. And so that again is a reminder. And of course, the third thing you remember was the tablets of stone. And remember that Moses initially broke the first set. Remember, he was upset with the people, and God replaced those. But now they're there. So these three things, again, are a reminder to the people that God says, here's something to remind you of what I have done. My provision I've made for you in terms of the food I provided, Aaron's leadership, and also the fact that indeed it reminds him about the law as well. Now, most important to us is that in study the tabernacle, remember, is how it relates to Jesus. So let's find out now what Hebrews says to us there about the relationship with Christ. First of all, in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 18 through 20.
So that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement to hold firmly to the hope set before us. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and reliable, and one which enters within the veil, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner to us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek.
Remember what happened to the veil? The veil was rent in twain. Notice what it says now. No longer is there division. You see, the one who indeed provides for us salvation has gone through. In other words, he's now seated at the right hand of the Father. And so it's a reminder to us again of that provision. All right, also in chapter 4, look at verse 16.
Therefore, let's approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace for help at the time of our need.
Think about it. Once a year, the high priest only, the high priest for that year, he was able to go back there. But think about, listen to what it says. You come whenever you need to. That's the difference. See, we have direct access to God's throne of mercy. The high priest could only go back there. He represented himself, also represented the people, but it was only once a year. And so that's a reminder to us, God's given us a perfect relationship through Christ to him. All right, also in chapter 10 of Hebrews, listen to what it says in verses 1 through verses 4.
For the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the form of those things itself, can never, by the same sacrifices which they offer continually every year, make those who approach perfect. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? Because the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have a consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins.
Think about it. If the blood of bulls and goats would have taken when Christ would have never gone to the cross. There'd been no need for it. And so what Hebrews is reminding us, listen, there had to be a completion as far as God's acceptance, and of course that only could come through what Christ did for us. And so as a result, every year they had to do it over, continuously doing it over and over and over again. It was just for 1 year, and then they do it the next year and the next year. But look at the difference. Listen to what it says now. Terry, I believe you also have verse 12 there in chapter 10.
But he, having offered one sacrifice for sins of all time, sat down at the right hand of God.
Isn't that something? He completed it. That's it. It's done. There's no need. And of course, again, it reminds us that veil's been cut in two. As a result, we've got a direct access to the mercy seat. So that's a reminder to us of God's provision for us. Now, let's also look, if you will, at chapter 12, verse 24.
And to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood, which speaks better than the blood of Abel.
This is what he has done. He's completed everything. So everything was essential. All that God needed to be done. Remember, Scripture says he's a perpetuation, which means he's a complete sacrifice. He's all that was as far as needed. God says, I've accepted it. This is what's happened. And as a result, we have that relationship. Now, I want to call your attention and just for a moment to look at this next section, and then I'm going to take you through the experience of that day as far as with the high priest. But let's look together at the priestly attire there. You notice my beautiful picture, and Miss Mary wanted me to hand out crayons for y'all to color that. I did not do that tonight, but I probably should have. But let's look, if you will, now at Exodus chapter 28, verse 29. We'll not take time to read Leviticus 8, but you'll want to read that chapter. But Exodus 28, verse 29.
So Aaron shall bear the names of the sons of Israel on the breastplate of judgment over his heart, when he goes into the holy place as a memorial before the Lord continually.
I just want to call your attention now. Remember, we've talked about the colors and how important the colors are. Look at the colors coming out again. We saw that in regard to, remember, the entrance as far as the veil coming in to the tabernacle. We see it in terms of the ceiling inside the holy place. All of those colors are over and over again. So it's a reminder, the blue, the purple, scarlet, the white. Notice also in regard to his robe now, we also see the color there. And then I want you to call your attention, because it's going to come out in our study as we look at further as far as his experience. Look in regard to the letter B there, and look at the last part. Along the edging of his garment, notice what he had, gold bells. Why in the world did he have bells on there?
So they could hear he was moving.
Yeah, we're gonna find out, aren't we? Yeah, we're gonna find out why he had bells on there, aren't we? Just a moment, we'll talk about that. Now, notice also the rest of the garment. You want to look at it. It describes and it shows you the picture there, of course, as far as the types and the various parts of that. But what I want us to drop down to is that last one, and that is the letter I. I want you to notice the Urim and Thummim. You're probably familiar with that term. You probably have heard it. These were two stone-like. We don't have a definite type of what it was. Scholars differ. What they do agree on is that this was something that the high priest would use to make a decision. In other words, whether it was a black stone and a white stone, whether it was a yes or was a no, we don't know that. What we do know, it was used for them to make a decision. So in other words, whenever they were making a decision, then they would use these two things. And so that's the reason those things are mentioned. So it does objects, and certainly, and like I say, some say there were stones. The other thing I want to call your attention to, I want you to notice is letter D. You notice the 12 precious stones. There was a stone for every one of the 12 tribes. So whenever the high priest went in, he had this garb on. Whenever he went in, he also was mindful of the fact, I represent all the tribes. All 12 tribes are represented. And so that's what those stones are really involved. Below there, you notice the numbers. Of course, we've mentioned those before. Now, let's think about the experience of the high priest at this time now. Think about this. If you look in book of Leviticus, you're going to find this set out in terms of what has to happen. The first thing that would have to happen is the high priest, representing himself and his family, had to make provision for his sins. So there had to be a sacrifice. So he would make a sacrifice for his sins and his family's sins. That's the first thing you have to do. Once that was done, then he would also not only take that blood, but also he would go and he would take the ashes, and he would make from that he would take that in terms of let me get it in just a minute. The altar of incense, that would be mixed. And so when he went behind that veil, he would have this container. And not only would it be the blood from the sacrifice for he and his family, but also there would be the representation of the ark of incense. Remember, that has to do with the prayers of God's people. Now, it's interesting, if you look at the book of Leviticus, he says, first of all, the writer says, you have to make sure you put that around so that it's covered with the smoke, representing the prayers of God's people. In other words, the high priest had to make sure the first thing he did, he was in contact with God as far as prayer. And then in addition to that, it says he would take the blood, then he would put that on the mercy seat. And again, this is representing he and his family. That's the first thing that was done. He would go back out, and there would be then the sacrifice. Remember that he had to make a sacrifice, one for the people of Israel. Remember, this is a one time a year. And remember, this is for the national sins, not the individual sins, but the sins of the nation. And so remember, in that case, what they would have is